All right, everybody, then let's get going here with our webinar for today, sharing and deploying data science with KNIME Server. My name is Roland. I work for KNIME as the KNIME Server product owner, and we're live from our Berlin office. With me in the webinar today are my colleagues Renee, Thomas, and Masoud, who will also be answering questions in the chat. But please, if you have any questions, so just run them by the chat or post them to the Q&As, because that's a bit easier to manage later on, so we can also make sure that nothing gets buried in the chat history somewhere. What just said here on the slides, since there's a question already regarding those slides, yes, we will share the slides. Later on, I will upload them to our SharePoint device, and then our event team will send them to you via email, of course, yes. Although I have to say that a large part of the session is going to be a live demo, there's corresponding screenshots to that in the slides, but obviously it's not going to be the exact same thing. So we'll see what we get there, but all of you will get slides later on, sure. Right. Okay. So what are we going to do today? Today we're gonna introduce you to all the great KNIME Server features for collaboration, automation, deployment, and management. So we're gonna cover everything pretty much that you need to manage your analytics at scale. So deploying your workflows for sharing and collaboration, scheduling and automating tasks, templating, version control, as well as enterprise integration. We're also going to delve a bit into the power of the REST API of KNIME Server, and you'll get to know the KNIME Web Portal in quite a bit of detail. So a very nice front-end web-based way of bringing data analytics to your non-experts. Let's start here with one of the most important challenges when dealing with data science projects. So let's say you have a great set of tools and you have all the right people using them. And for the most part, they're producing great results. So what you see here on the left-hand side, that stuff is working perfectly fine. But what about the right here? So how can you make sure that whatever you produce in terms of data science is more than just a collection of isolated projects? So basically, how do you actually bring your work to production? And of course, how do you maximize the benefits for your organization? And this right here, exactly what you have on the right-hand side here, is where KNIME Server comes into play. Start off here, let's have a quick look at how KNIME Server and Analytics Platform tie together. So on the left-hand side here, we have the Analytics Platform component of things. So this is our open source product. Can be extended by various things, either by extensions or integrations developed by ourselves as a company. There's a lot of stuff coming from our community and also a lot of great things coming from our partners. So here you have everything basically to create workflows that transform data, push data from somewhere to somewhere else, create models, create visualizations, and whatever else. All of this works perfectly fine. Where it does become a bit tricky, though, is when we're talking about how we can take all the great work we built in our local environments and deploy it somewhere to push it into production to have a real impact. And exactly this is where KNIME Server comes into play. So we're talking about deployment and management here, about finding ways to basically make stuff accessible to a very large, very diverse audience. In many cases, an audience of non-experts, so people who are not expert-trained data scientists, who are not KNIME specialists, who might not even know actually what KNIME is in the first place. So their job is more to make sense of the data, not to build workflows. So they're consumers in our sense. And we're also going to show you what we got in store for those guys. Right, just here another really quick overview of the topics we're going to cover today. But honestly, let's not spend too much on those slides here. Let's go on and see KNIME Server live and in action. Yeah, so basically the first thing I want to show you for how to work with KNIME Server is obviously how KNIME Server integrates with the Analytics Platform. And there, of course, the first step is to connect to KNIME Server in the first place. To get started here, if we didn't hadn't done that already, we would have to add KNIME Server as an additional mount point to our KNIME Explorer. We do this by clicking this button here, click on New, enter the server address, click OK, and that's it. So I've added my server already here, so I'm not going to do that, but just so you know, if you ever need to add a KNIME server, hit this button, follow a couple of very easy steps. Now to connect, what I do here is double click on the mount point name, enter my credentials, click OK, and that's it, we're good to go. And another thing I have to mention here for authentication, what I did right now is on my local test server here using a local integrated database. But for authentication, you can also use your organization's LDAP Active Directory system for centralized administration or security, as well as OAuth or OIDC for support of a large selection of different identity providers, which we have recently added here. Right, since we're now connected to KNIME Server, we have access to all resources on the server that are hosted on the server's repository. So there's workflow groups or directories, there's actual workflows, there can be jobs, data files, component templates, and so on and so forth. So you see this here is one of the core pieces needed for collaboration, make your work accessible for your colleagues in a single centralized instance. And I'm now going to show you all of this functionality in a bit more detail here. First of all, most importantly, let's see how we can actually bring our work to the KNIME server. This is very, very straightforward. There's a couple ways to do that. You can either just from the local mount point to the server mount point, copy paste, drag and drop, or if you want a more, let's say, elegant and a bit safer way to do this is you right-click a workflow, deploy to server, then you can select a server where you want to store this on. Let's take this one here. If you want, you can also reset the workflow before upload. Click OK. And that's it. You see this workflow is now available on my KNIME server. Next, I want to quickly introduce another thing that can make collaboration a lot easier. Those are component templates. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with components, components basically wrap a number of nodes together so that you can use them like a single standalone node, to put it in very simple terms at least. Now, the great thing about components is their reusability, because, well, components are for sharing, as you might have seen actually in the last days during the summit sessions. So let's say there's a couple of routines that you need in many, many workflows, like, for example, connecting to a database, some standard pre-processing, and so on. In that case, you can just store a component as a template on a server. Let me quick show you how this works. Open a workflow. That's a component here. Take this, right-click, component, share. Then we select the location on the server. Let's just put it here in the root directory. And I have now on my KNIME server created a new component template named select data file. I can now drag this in the same workflow again. I can use many, many other workflows, however I please. Now, the great thing about this here is that this component is linked, as indicated by this little green arrow here in the lower left corner. And the link here is to the template on my KNIME server. This means that whenever I go ahead now and change something in the underlying template, I can automatically update all workflows that use the component. So you can use KNIME server not only for sharing full workflows, but also to provide reusable workflow components, which obviously then saves you the hassle of starting from scratch every time you're building a new workflow. And of course, you can bring collaboration to a, let's say, somewhat different level by providing a set of standardized components that can then be used throughout your organization. Right, so that's it so far about collaboration, sharing, and teamwork. But obviously, KNIME server offers a lot more different things. Let's have a look now how we can actually bring our work to production. So now that our workflow is on KNIME server, I want to execute it there as well, of course. All workflows on KNIME server can be executed directly on the server machine, which gets you around the obvious limitations of desktop machines. Now, to start a workflow on KNIME server, that's a bit different than your local environment, because what you do here is you right-click the workflow, hit execute, which then opens a new dialog. Now, if I wanted to execute this workflow right away, I could just click OK here, and that would be it. There's also a couple options to add notification emails, so I can send notification emails if the workflow was successful, or if it failed, or both. That's really up to you. You can add comma-separated list of email addresses. You can also send different recipients for different success-failure scenarios, for example. You can also create reports, attach them to the emails, or write them directly to the KNIME server. And if your workflow has a couple of and if you want to use this workflow to call another workflow once it is completed, so basically conditional, if this workflow either succeeds or fails, call this other workflow. You can here also sort of have a orchestration pipeline of different workflows that should be run in sequence. The other thing we have here is scheduling options. Here we can define the workflow to run on a certain schedule, so either one time on a fixed date or in a repeated interval. Let's say, for example, I want this workflow to run every day or every, let's say, 3 hours or something like that. I can also say this should only run on a weekday. Or I can say, okay, this stuff should be run on a Sunday afternoon, because maybe then I know that there's very little traffic on my KNIME server. I have a very heavy-duty workflow, and this should only be run on a Sunday. So that makes life a bit easier for my colleagues, for example, because we're not competing for resources there. You can even set specific days of the month. So, for example, you have a report that should be sent out on every 1st or every 15th of the month. Just make the right checkboxes here, and you're good to go. Certain months or certain time frames. For example, I can see here for time frames, this workflow should run once every hour, but only between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning. Again, just to avoid some clashes with my colleagues for computational resources. Finally, we have here the configuration options tab. Now, this workflow, unfortunately, doesn't have any configuration nodes inside of them. But if there were any of our configuration nodes on the top level of this workflow, those would show up here, and I have direct access into them. So whatever, for example, if I have a credentials configuration node in there, I could pass my credentials at runtime to the workflow, execute it, so I don't have to store any credentials in the workflow directly, thus making it much safer for sharing with my colleagues. Right, so much about the execution dialog. Let us quick start a job. Okay, click OK. And then you see we create a job, and we can actually go into this job and see live what's happening in there. So this is not a plain view here. This is really live what's happening on the server. See the execution of the workflow, which is very helpful if you have longer running jobs. I mean, this one was very fast, maybe let's say 15 seconds at most. If you have a workflow that runs for a couple hours, this is a very nice way to track every single bit of process this workflow is having. But actually, it's a lot more than just a plain view. You can also go here. You can reset nodes. You can execute them again. You can open the node configuration dialog, change something in the configuration, and rerun them, which obviously is very helpful in case a job has failed. I mean, that's one of the nice things about KNIME. You can pretty much reset a workflow until every point somewhere, and then just go on from there. Let's say the k-means node had a bit of misconfiguration, so I could just go ahead here and it failed, run it again, change the configuration, and if it's a workflow that has been run for a couple hours before that, there's really no need to start all over again from the beginning, which is really great about KNIME. Apart from that, I can actually change the workflow. I can drag nodes around. I could delete nodes here. I can say, okay, I need a column filter somewhere in there. drag this one into my workflow, connect new nodes, whatever else. Really change the workflow like it was a local editor, but it's important to point out that every single thing I do here has a direct effect on that job running on my KNIME server. Another benefit of using this remote editor is that everything I do here also naturally happens in the server's own environment. So for example, if you need access to certain databases or a Hadoop cluster, which you cannot even access from your local client, you can just host a KNIME server in the same secured environment, which then saves you the trouble of accessing those environments from your own client that might be in an entirely different network, it might be in an unsafe network, and it couldn't really attach those resources in the first place. All right, then let's have a look at the KNIME Web Portal actually. Until now, what you've seen thus far is how you can interact with the KNIME server from a local client. But that's by far not the only way how we can get stuff done on KNIME server. So first I want to introduce you to the Web Portal. This allows you to deploy workflows on your KNIME server as easy web applications, which can then be accessed from any browser. So there is no installation required here at all in order to consume those workflows. The target audience here is primarily end users with little to no KNIME knowledge at all. The idea here is to make your analytics accessible to a very broad audience. So those can be citizen data scientists, business analysts, management, and so on and so forth. So pretty much all people who know a lot about making sense of data, but who don't really know anything, or at least very little, about building sophisticated workflows, or who in some cases can't really be bothered to learn it because obviously you have a lot of other things to do if you're working. So all you need to do for making the web portal run is log in, select the workflow, and start the execution, which is what we're going to do right now. So let me just grab a workflow here. And for those of you who've been with KNIME for a bit longer, you will notice that this web portal looks very different than what you might be used to, which is because the reason for this is that we completely reworked this, put it out in the last release in July, and this is just great stuff. I'm super happy with how it turned out. It's a big step forward compared to what we had before. But enough about that. Let's just start a job here and see where we're headed. Right, let's click run, and you see here the idea is that what we're doing is we're going through the workflow execution step by step by using certain interaction points that are part of the workflow, and those points are defined by the workflow developer. So in the end, the users of the web portal, they don't really need to understand what's happening in the background. They only navigate through the simple and clean interface, which I have to mention also can be customized to match your corporate design as well. So you could have your own company logo here, for example, or some corporate font or corporate colors, whatever else. You could have it in there. And also to point this out, these views are all interactive. So for example, if you're interested in those couple data points over here, you can just select them and then you get only displayed those data points for sort of a data drill down here. So basically what you see here is what we call guided analytics. We guide the users through all steps of the analysis process, and wherever necessary, we provide some points of interactivity. So selecting data, defining model parameters, what I just did, and so on and so forth. Now, what's important to realize here is that it doesn't really matter how complex the underlying workflow is. The user only has to deal with the options that are relevant for a given task. So this can be a very simple workflow, like in this case, what I'm showing here. This is not at all complicated. Everybody can build this in half an hour. But it can also be a complete beast of a workflow with a couple of thousand individual nodes hosted in dozens and dozens of different components. Important here for the end user, they just go through this thing step by step, and it's all they need to deal with. Right, let me actually go back to the analytics platform and show you what this workflow actually looks like. So that's the one you just seen. And so if you have a look here, you also get an idea of basically how those web portal workflows are created. You see here in this workflow a couple of components, so a total of 3 components plus a couple of random nodes that do some stuff in between. Now, those components here in this case are not only for keeping the workflow tidy, they also provide certain interaction points, meaning that each component in this workflow corresponds to one page on the web portal. So remember, on the first page we had data selection. On the second page we defined how many clusters we want to use for our k-means clustering, and then we had the final results page. By doing this, the workflow developer can create a logical sequence, which then of course is one of the foundations of the so-called guiding part. So we navigate the user through the workflow step by step. Right, let's have a look inside this component here. Actually, you see a couple of different nodes in there. Now, the important thing here is that the only thing you will see on the web portal in the end is either one of our JavaScript-based views. So here we have a scatter plot and table view, or one of our widget nodes. In this case here, the text output widget. Now, widgets allow all kinds of interactive user inputs on the front end, like strings, numbers, we have file selection, file upload, value selection, and so on. There's a lot of things in there. Or like the text output widget, they just show some text. And then we use the input of those widgets to configure the various other nodes in the workflow. If we quickly go back to the first component we had here, we see that there's a file chooser widget in there, which allows us to select the file, which we then take the selection, turn to a flow variable, and then use this to parameterize the file reader node on the top level of the workflow. So you see here, it doesn't really matter how complex the actual workflow is. Guided analytics allows you to show only what's really important for the end user. Plus, this is also very easy to set up for the developer, because once we have built a workflow like this, the actual web application is created automatically. There's no coding required, and the KNIME server takes care of everything you do for you. All you need to do is really just upload the workflow to KNIME server. Everything else is created automatically. Quick go back to the slide. So if you want to see how far you can take this stuff, I highly recommend to have a look at our workflows for guided analytics for machine learning automation. Those might be a bit of an extreme example for how far you can take stuff on the web portal, but I still highly recommend them because they really get the point across that a workflow can be infinitively complex. I think there's like 1,500 nodes in there with components sometimes nested, I think 5 layers deep or something like this. So this takes months to build, really. But the nice part about this is, in order to run this workflow, to get the results, to make some sense of them, you don't need to have a single idea about what the workflow actually does as the end user. So really, you have an expert that can build that stuff, or a team of experts naturally, but the consumers that are just about to make some sense of the data, get some results, and be happy with that, they don't need to deal with all the madness that went into this workflow. I mean, this is a complete beast. Have a look at this one. It's amazing stuff that's in there, but we wouldn't expect anybody to ever build something like this themselves. It's a bit much, but it works great. I mean, that's again the nice part about the web portal. It just runs. Cool. Then the next thing I want to talk about is deployment via the KNIME server's REST API. I mean, in a sense, it is the complete opposite of the web portal, because the web portal focuses on interaction, on human input, and everything else. On the REST API, we try to keep things a bit more in the back end, to automate things and to just make everything as, let's say, seamless as possible. So basically, KNIME server REST API, very, very powerful tool, allows you to integrate the server with any application that can communicate via REST. So you can build applications around KNIME Server. You can deploy KNIME workflows as web services. For example, for real-time scoring is a very common use case here. Let's see a quick example here actually. So every workflow, first of all, every workflow you upload to KNIME Server is automatically available as a web service. You can then trigger execution of the workflow, but in some cases, if your workflows also contain one of the container input nodes, you can also parameterize pass data into the workflow via the API. Like here, we send data in JSON format to the server. Server receives the data, in this case, does some model prediction, turns back to JSON, and then we have this container output node, which sends the results back to, well, whichever application originally started this workflow. Well, forget that slide. We're done with the live demo. Right, then another thing, just to mention this quickly here, is version control of the KNIME server. Basically creating snapshots of workflows, revisions, also allowing you to roll back to a previous version, and you always get the full history of the workflow as well. As you can see here, there's two ways of creating such a snapshot. The first one is you just right-click the workflow, hit create snapshot, and you're good to go. Can also write a comment here, like what you changed in this actual part of the workflow. Or the other way to do this is anytime you try to override a workflow on KNIME server, there will be a prompt if you really want to override it. And if you do want to override it, you can then create a snapshot as well. And I think in the last release, KNIME Server 4.11, we added also a feature to enforce this creation of a snapshot. So if it's really important to you that your users have to create a snapshot every time they override something, you can do that as well. The other thing we have here, which is very useful in combination with the snapshotting tool, is the workflow difference functionality. This allows you to take two versions of the same workflow and compare them to each other, so you get a side-by-side view of what's different between those two. So for example, we see in this screenshot here, we have in the newer version added a bar chart node. First of all, so we compare on the level of the nodes included in the workflow. Also, as you can see here highlighted in gray, there's this k-means node for which we have come up with different configuration parameters. So there's also a difference in settings between those two workflows. So really, if you have two different versions of the same workflow, there's no need to open both of them and then put them somehow weirdly side by side, going through each and every node just to see what's different. No, just select both workflows, right-click, click compare, and that's it. Right, then the other very important point here is permission management. So just because you can collaborate, of course, doesn't mean that everybody should have access to everything on KNIME server. Because of that, you can define permissions for every item on the KNIME server, so you can control which groups or individual users can access, modify, or execute a workflow. To do that, you just right-click the workflow, click permissions, and let me quickly actually just show you this live. So, come on. You right-click the workflow on the server, not locally, so not what I just did. Right-click permissions, opens a permission dialog, so I can say here owner, groups, and world. Let's unassign everything for world. Let's say there's a group named finance. Those guys should only have read and execute permissions. Then there's also developers, and they should be allowed to do everything. And that's it. Click OK, and now we have set up permissions here. This is also a nice way, obviously, to manage different projects. So, for example, you can say that project A should only have access to a specific set of workflows or resources. Project B should have access to another set of workflows. For example, especially if you're dealing with the web portal, if you have a very heterogeneous environment in terms of end users, you can say there's a certain project who should access all web portal workflows, and there's another project who should only access a small subset or even a single workflow on the web portal if you want to take things a bit farther. All right, let's move quickly back to our slides to see a couple of features to make your IT department happy. Now, the first feature here is very useful for admins. These are server managed customizations. So in many companies, different groups of people require very different setups, and it's often the job of the administrator to make sure that, well, everybody really gets what they need. Now, this used to be quite a bit of manual work for things like setting up database drivers, Python preferences, adding the server mount points, and so forth. So several releases back, we added central management of client preferences to KNIME Server. So you can now store a set of preference files on the server, and each client just fetches the specific profile that they need, which is then obviously a very easy way to make sure that every client is set up exactly as needed and saves a ton of work in client rollout, no matter how large the deployment is. Right, then let's have a look at the different options we have for scaling up the KNIME server, especially in terms of running KNIME server with multiple executors. So what you can do in this sense is basically have one central KNIME server that via a message queue system connects to one or more executors, where executors can just be arbitrarily added to the mix, therefore allowing you to scale up. Really, no matter what your computational needs are, just add more executors to the mix. And we also support executors with different configuration options for maximum flexibility, which you see here, for example, in terms of how we can plan our computational capacities, how we can have a better routing and better monitoring of the workflows. One example, one thing we can do here is workflow pinning. Basically, we define, first of all, on the executor side, which resources a particular executor has. And then on the workflow side, we make sure that a workflow is tagged in a certain way that it will get sent to the correct executor. Here in this case, for example, we have a couple of different executors available. So the first one has quite a few CPU cores. It's very low in terms of GPU, probably doesn't have a GPU. Let's pretend it doesn't have a GPU, and very little memory. This is owned by the engineering department and is located in Europe. Then there's another executor with average CPU, good GPU power, and medium memory, which is not for any specific department and takes jobs from worldwide. By setting properties like those, you can make sure that each workflow gets only sent to an executor with matching properties. So for example, if you say you have a workflow that does some deep learning in Keras, and it really needs a GPU to make that in a somewhat efficient way, with using executor pinning or executor reservation, you can make sure that this workflow will only be sent to an executor that provides those resources. Or you have a workflow that needs tons of memory, and by setting those requirements, you can also make sure that it gets sent to an executor with an appropriate amount of memory, so you just don't basically, well, drown an executor under your workload because it doesn't have sufficient memory, for example. The other thing you can do here in terms of reservation is make sure that, the next slide, yeah, move on to the executor groups, which is very nice for having one single KNIME server that serves let's say a very heterogeneous environment, not only in terms of, let's say, capabilities in terms of execution like GPU, memory, whatever else, but also in terms of the people who start the workflows. So for example, I can say I have one workflow group. This is a group of, I have one executor group. This is a group of multiple executors, can only be a single executor, but typically multiple executors. I have a group of executors that belongs exclusively to the marketing department. Or I have another group of executors that is used exclusively by the finance departments. I mean, that's one scenario we have from quite a couple of our larger customers. So there, in this case, the central IT purchases a large KNIME server with many managed execution cores that they can split up over the various groups. And they then resell it internally as sort of an internal service provider. Then, of course, if the marketing department pays a certain amount of money to their IT for those execution privileges, we want to make sure, obviously, that jobs from other departments don't block their resources. So you should really get what you're paying for. So in this case, we would have a setup that's split according to those departments or business units. So jobs started by somebody from the marketing department only get executed on their own executors. If you're in the finance group, you get your own executors. Engineering also gets their own executors. So we really check which LDAP Active Directory, or in some cases YDC groups here, a user is associated with, and then run the workflows on the executor group with the correct permission set up as well. Okay, then a couple of words here about our different deployment options. So you can install KNIME Server both on-prem as well as in the cloud. On the cloud, we have pre-built offerings on both Amazon AWS as well as on Microsoft Azure. This can be a standard analytics platform, which we host there. There's also a ton of options for ready-made, ready-configured KNIME Server images. There's a bring your own license option where you would still purchase a license from us and then just run it on the cloud. But by now, we also have most of our offerings in a pay-as-you-go mode as well. So you can also rent KNIME Server hourly if that's what you want to do. In terms of pay-as-you-go, what I also want to point out is that we offer pay-as-you-go executors. So you can have a KNIME Server that you run year-round, basically, and then one or more executors that you just really rent as you need them. So there might be a certain spike in computational needs, lots of requests coming in. In this case, you can automatically spin up one of those pay-as-you-go executors, run it as long as those requests do come in. If not, it will automatically go in a draining state and then turn off after a while, thus saving you money. So there's no need for catching those, let's say, capacity spikes to maintain an environment year-round, really. Here just a couple more words about this whole idea of auto-scaling. So we do allow you to scale elastically to meet any demand you want to throw at the KNIME Server. So basically scale out in terms of in case you need more resources for let's say more or less short period, and then afterwards, once the period is gone, we just scale back in to save costs in the long term. Okay, the slide actually should have been updated like 2 days ago. So we say here that this is supported in AWS and Azure by the pay-as-you-go licensing model. Here it says available later on 2020 for Azure. This actually was released just this week. So we also have now pay-as-you-go executors available on Microsoft Azure already. So forget that available later part here, it's already there. Right, then what's the more typical use case here for our customers is that they purchase a couple of licenses year round in a bring your own license style. And then if they have some periodic demands, let's say, for example, you're an online retailer, you have a certain seasonal spikes around, let's say, Black Friday happening right now, next week, then for those spikes, you could use pay-as-you-go executors to catch that stuff and then just turn them off again. So really no need to pay for all the infrastructure the whole year round. It's also possible on top of that to run a hybrid usage model. So you can have a KNIME server and a couple of executors on premise, both bring your own license, paid year round. And then in case you have, we'll say, a bit more extraordinary computational needs, you can start those pay-as-you-go executors in the cloud and again, turn them off once they're not needed anymore. Or like we say here on the slides here, if you only need to train a deep learning model once a month or something like that, there's really no need to pay for a GPU instance year-round. Just run it a couple hours or a couple days every month and then turn it off again. That's all fine. Right, then here, just another quick overview of the things we talked about today. So basically all you need for collaboration, automation, deployment, and management. And of course, very, very important, if you're ready to get started with KNIME Server, if you're interested, just reach out to us for a free trial at contact@knime.com. Or if you're ready to go without contacting us, there's also free trial versions of KNIME Server Small on Amazon AWS. Thanks everybody for joining. Have a nice day, have a nice evening wherever you are. Take care and goodbye. Thanks everyone.